So we're really delighted that Martin is able to join us tonight. Martin has over 10 years of experience as a wildlife photographer and is a regular guide for wildlife tour company Nature Trek. Martin has worked in Yorkshire and Alderney, the Channel Islands, for the Wildlife Trusts. He now serves on the North Devon Coast AONB partnership and is also a trustee of the North Devon Environmental Trust. And I know that you're involved as well, Martin, with the steering group for Horsey Island. So I'll let you explain more about that and your role there. But yes, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed, Nicola. It's great to be back here talking to you. I'm just going to try and share my screen now. So just bear with me a second. Here we go. And we can take to presentation. There we go. We went back to previous. So, right, there's the title slide. I've got a false start there slightly. So it's really good to be back here, everybody, to give you another talk about local wildlife. And I'm going to be covering about 30 different birds that you can see on that patch of mud that you can see in the middle of the picture, which is taken from the top of Braunton Down. And that's what it looked like when it flooded. And then I think people were a bit depressed by what they saw, a breach in the flood bank on the River Cane that flooded what was some freshwater grazing marsh. And we're actually so lucky to live in an area like this, you know, with this wonderful estuary in the middle of a natural landscape, designated biosphere reserve, a UNESCO biosphere reserve. And, you know, I make no apologies for saying it's an area of outstanding natural beauty. And I'm very proud to be able to serve on the partnership for that. It's also under the late lamented European Union, their Habitats Directive. It's a special area of conservation, which features Braunton Burrows just off to the right there. So it's a very important area for nature. And I've heard it said that Braunton is actually one of the most biodiverse parishes in the whole country. It's got this fantastic rocky coast with all those rock pools and sea creatures. We've got sandy beaches, vast sandy beaches and huge sand dunes, full of wonderful plants, as we heard last week. And this estuary you can see in front of us here, the rivers and marshes, and now increasingly, which is great news, salt marsh, and a new habitat for Braunton in many ways. We only had small patches of it before. And actually, when we look at it in winter, it's actually the best time of all to look at Horsey Island. So without further ado, let's go and have a look at what we're talking about here. Well, Horsey, as you see there in the top left-hand corner, was once part of, I suppose you could say it still is to some extent, part of Braunton Marshes, a unique microcosm of traditional rural life, as somebody once said in a report that I read. The marshes were actually only enclosed in about 1811, and they've been managed ever since by the Braunton Marsh inspectors and the Internal Drainage Board. And it's important to remember that they were salt marsh before, and you can still see in the channels that still run through the winding channels running through the marshes, the forms of the old channels through the mud. And Horsey was part of that. The marsh lies actually on top of about 30 meters of sediment, which has flowed down that river system, you know, with erosion from both Exmoor and Dartmoor. And over 2 million years, there's been huge fluctuations in sea levels. I mean, this map here is about 1870, I think, with the railway certainly in on the south bank there. We can't see the railway in the north bank. This sea level changes have produced things like the Great Field, which is a river terrace, actually left high and dry when the ancient river course deepened and the sea level sank, so leaving us with wonderful fertile marsh. And then offshore, massive accumulations of glacial deposits of rock and sand accumulated out to sea, and they have been increasingly coming back up the River Tor and onto the burrows. And you can see evidence of the vast amount of sand on the raised beach. You can see it in the Saunton Cliff. And there's actually 6 meters of sand on West Hill underneath the buildings. The Braunton Burrows dunes are probably about no less than 12,000 years old, and maybe more recently after the Little Ice Age in the 14th century. Not exactly sure. And the burrows were a key to the formation of the marsh because they provided that shelter, that barrier from the sea that enabled the sediment from the rivers to settle out and form these muddy sediments, which later form marshes. So it's incredibly important that that process is still continuing. So after this initial reclamation and 1811 to 1815, there was another reclamation, which at Velator and Rafton Marsh, plus what was called a barren patch of sand at Horsey Island, which is right in the middle of the right-hand part of the map. And then Braunton Pill, which through which flows the River Cane, was straightened. By the 1870s, really expensive work was required at the western end of the Horsey embankment and the Pill, because parts of that embankment are built on quicksand. But in December 1910, there was a massive southwest gale with high tides, and it destroyed part of that outer bank, which you can see the former southwest coast path ran along. And it broke in 5 places and deposited sand and gravel on the marshes. So not good news. It had a huge impact on Horsey Island. And it was, that failure was blamed possibly on burrowing rats. So there was a breach about 250 feet long, and repairs were required to cost about £2 million at 2020 prices. So Horsey Island is actually, there it is from the Google Maps in 2017. It was, as you can see, the same color as all the rest of the Braunton Marsh. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, you can see the outflow. And I've just blown that up a little bit so you can see what it looked like in September 2017. There was some damage around the outflow pipe, and there were worries about what would happen. And then I'd been taking pictures and met a local bird watcher called Rob Jutsam, and we were talking about birds there. And a few days later, there was this massive tide, and this breach opened up in the wall of the Cane River bank, and this was taken a few weeks later after quite a lot of, you still see a lot of grass around, quite a lot of water movement, as you can see. And the bank was clearly not built for that kind of, to cope with that kind of flow from the inside of the area. And this resulted in a lot of the linneys being surrounded with seawater at high tide, and there's some cormorants drying their wings on a misty morning. The whole site now has incredibly high tidal energy, which means it encloses a vast volume of water, which all has to rush out through that one gap, which is now about 100 meters wide. But it was pointed out to me today by Rob, actually, that well, this could be helping the flood defense of places like Velator, because it's actually absorbing all that amount of flood water at each tide. So long may it last. So there's some more cormorants on that misty morning. Wonder if that's about, I think that was probably September, October 2018. And since then, and there you can see some of the flooded, early flooded Horsey Island before things had started to die. Now those poor old trees have fully died, I'm afraid. And the breach looks more like this, with that linney with the cormorants on looks like this. It looks like HMS Dreadnought coming into harbour, the submarine in the mist. And there it is again. So we've had a substantial change in landscape here. And what one began to notice very early on, that there was colonization, you can see in the front of that picture, by some really important plants, the salt marsh plants. And you can see in that sunset shot of some of those salt marsh plants just beginning to grow either side of that fence where there's a bit of shelter. They need shelter from strong currents. They can't cope putting down roots in areas of high tidal movement. So we need those shelter bits for it to get a foothold. So if you look at the estuary as a whole, those dark green areas in the map on the left are areas of a potential new habitat creation. And you can see Horsey there, that triangle in the top left-hand corner over here. That's Horsey, and that's one of the largest areas of potential new habitat. And you've got this whole area around it, around Chivenor and Velator, which the two together, Devon Wildlife Trust, have called the Cane Wetlands, and it's very exciting. They want to manage the site for both areas of habitat, and we'll go on to talk about what's happening there. And you can see the other areas of dark green where there's quite a lot of new habitat here, and some of that might be coastal grazing marsh, because what we've got to remember is if we lose coastal grazing marsh, we've lost that biodiversity to mudflats and emergent salt marsh, and we need to think about replacing it. We're always trying to retain as much of each habitat as we can. So what have we got? We've got, there it is, probably 2018, where it's just wonderful mud there. And you look closely at it, it doesn't seem to have very much life in it, but actually it's full of invertebrates. And my colleagues, when I worked on the Humber estuary at Spurn Point, used to tell me that a cubic foot of that mud contains as much calorific value in invertebrates as a Mars bar. So that's about 300 calories, a lot of potential energy for a wading bird to dip its bill in and extract, well, invert snails, crustaceans, and so on. So very, very important. But perhaps more important is this stuff. This is the area down by, seen from the flood bank looking towards the White House there. This is new salt marsh. Now that used to be grass, and it's colonized incredibly fast. This is Salicornia or glasswort, and some other species that we'll look at in a minute. So that is forming really valuable new habitat. It's valuable for a number of reasons. Salt marsh occurs between low and high tide marks on flat or flat land in sheltered places in the estuaries. It needs that shelter in order to get the seeds to get a foothold. The seeds are actually in the water column. They're floating up and down the estuary all the time because there are other bits of salt marsh that inhabit the estuary. This is probably about the largest. This is about 80 plus hectares we've got here at Horsey. It's a significant amount of new salt marsh, one of the largest areas of new salt marsh in Devon, I think. And salt marsh plants are quite interesting. They've evolved special devices to enable them to survive in the conditions. When you imagine, most plants, flowering plants, like freshwater, and it's only things like eelgrass that can survive in the sea, another flowering plant. And they have, some of them have fleshy swollen stems like these, glasswort, and they have reduced or very modified leaves, which are quite tasty if you pick them at the right time and eat them with some nice fish. We're trying to hang on to as much of it as we can, but it doesn't do any harm to pick a little bit of it. Some of them have creeping rhizomes that help to bind the sand and the mud. And the most important thing is the sap in their cells, which contains very high concentrations of salt. And you think, well, that doesn't seem right. Why would a plant have loads of salt in it? Well, it's actually to enable it to survive, because it needs to have more salt in than the sea outside to enable osmosis to take place, that vital function of plants. So this is what Horsey looks like. This is a few weeks ago, and you've got these gradations here. You've got sand in the front, you've got mud, and then mud with algae on, which is another salt marsh plant. There's these sort of seaweeds that you see on the beach at the White House. And then you've got various salt marsh grasses, and there's more where it's purple there, that's more salicornia, more glasswort. So the whole site is covered now with salt marsh, salt tolerant plants. And when I showed you that picture just now, the glasswort, I mean, that was colonizing within a year. It was a substantial community. Now, let's see. So the benefits, what are the benefits? You can see, might see a few birds in there. We'll come on to them. Those little brown jobs in the middle there, middle distance, they're very important at Horsey. So salt marsh plants, they absorb wave energy and tidal flows, and they slow water down and trap sediment, and they help build up the land levels. So they're actually really good flood defenses. So it's encouraging that the salt marsh is growing really well along the inner bank, because that'll protect that inner bank as time goes by, and it'll help build up the land adjacent to the bank. And when you think that we're expecting sea level rise in the Bristol Channel, you know, if we carry on as we are with the expected level of carbon in the atmosphere, by 2100, the sea is expected to have risen by between 1/3 and 0.8 of a meter by the end of the century. Now that is substantial, when we've only seen really a few millimeters, a few centimeters even of sea level rise so far. When you take that with the increased storminess that is going to happen, as we're seeing more and more of, then the outlook is worrying. Now, the other thing that they provide is salt marshes are high tide roosts, and they're very important on the Torres due to the high level of disturbance. So you can find an area like Horsey, which is protected from human and other animal disturbance, naming no names. There is great value in having that. So the trouble is, if birds keep being disturbed, they lose their condition for survival and reduce breeding condition. Now, the other thing that salt marshes are good for, which I hadn't really thought about until Devon Wildlife Trust came along and said, do you want to get involved in helping us with this? Because I've done similar things in Yorkshire, but we'd never really had the salt marsh potential as we've got here. Salt marsh and mud are absolutely vital in sequestering carbon. So what they do is they pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and we all know we've got far too much of it. You know, it's over 400 parts per million now in the atmosphere. I think that's the right unit, but we're going way over what it was in Victorian times, mid-Victorian times, when all this started, when it was about 200. So we're really putting far too much carbon into the atmosphere. Salt marsh actually pulls it out. It puts it into growing salt marsh and embeds it into the land. So salt marsh actually, I was told at a conference the other week, contains 50% of the total ocean carbon storage potential. Just think about that. That's incredible. So it's much higher potential than even the Amazon rainforest, because it grows so fast, and it can cover vast areas of land to great depth. It's like peat bog, really. That's another one that does that. So in descending order of value, actually mangroves are the best, and then salt marsh, which can pull out 1 to 4 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare per year. So it's really, and you saw how fast it grows at Horsey. And then you've got the other marine providers of sequestration, seagrass meadows and merle, which we don't get here. You need that in shallow seas, like around Jersey in the Channel Islands. They've got a lot of merle. And biogenic reefs, well, we wish we had a few more of those, but the Great Barrier is the best example, of course. And then muds, also important, and the macroalgae that grows on the mud and also in the ocean, but they're far less important than salt marsh itself. So Devon Wildlife Trust took over this site in November 2019 and immediately started monitoring this outer bank, which is slightly worrying in its condition, as you can see, or very worrying. And it's possible that we might lose, that might breach during this winter if there's a combination of a very big tide and the right wind conditions that cause wave action that would breach. I think it did overtop, I was told, this past weekend in some places, just slightly. So we've got to brace ourselves for the fact that this is going to go, and the trust has had some consultants look at it, and they've realized that it really needs replacing along 600 meters of its length, and that's going to cost over £2 million, probably more, and actually impossible amounts of material to put it right. And then because of rising sea levels, this might only last a short time, relatively short time, and it's certainly not something I'm afraid the trust can afford. So what it wants to do is work with the community and the neighbouring landowners, and just make sure that we prepare for this, because I'm afraid it's inevitable. And but what we are assured is that the inner bank, which protects the marsh, for the moment is not under threat, and nor is the living accommodation around Rafton and Velator. That's all safe. The Environment Agency have confirmed that. So what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with a nature reserve where we once had an expanse of mud, and a managed nature reserve, which is great news for Braunton. And it's already providing a home for a range of species that weren't there before. This is really quite interesting to watch develop, because we're talking about less than 4 years. We're talking about 3 years actually, that aren't we, since November 2017, which is just as I moved to the area. So I'm hoping that anyone who is there, who knows this area better than I do, you can't learn everything in less than 4 years, but I picked up a lot, but I'm still not going to get everything right. So I'd like us to have a good conversation at the end of this, and you can put me right, I'm sure. But we have a Devon Wildlife Trust Nature Reserve, which is great news. I hope you all agree. And it's great for wildlife. It's going to be really fantastic. Here's a little egret and a flock of golden plover behind, but it's already changing in its atmosphere and feel as to what it was before. And I'm very lucky. I just saw it the last few weeks of it being a freshwater grazing marsh, and now it's most definitely a salt marsh and mud environment. So let's have a look at some of the animals that live here. And first of all, the ducks, because, well, they're great, aren't they? And they're sometimes the most obvious things you can see. Now, this is a group on the channel near the White House. Those posts will be recognizable to a lot of you who live here. And that's a group of teal, Eurasian teal. And they're one of our smallest ducks, and very common on passage in the autumn and spring, and as winter visitors to Horsey. And they're actually a beautiful little bird. They're about a third of the size of a mallard, so really tiny. They're about the size of a sort of half-grown mallard duckling. And there's only very small numbers of them actually breed in the area. They mostly fly off northwards to Scandinavia, to Eastern Europe, and even further. And the Tor estuary actually is a really important overwintering site for them in Devon. But we get about between 300 and 1,500 here on the estuary between November and about April. And they're great because when you do disturb them, which you inevitably do, because they're very wary bird, they leap from the water and then dash about in the air with very rapid flight. So they only weigh about between 250 and 350 grams, depending on whether it's a male or female and what condition they're in. And they favor the shallow areas over soft mud. They're a real dabbling duck, and they thrust their bills in, upend themselves. Normally quite a wary bird to see, but there's one taking off, and wonderful color of the wing feathers, and that you'll find that area around the head, the eye, changes color from dark blue to green or turquoise, depending on what angle you view them at. It's wonderful feathers. And then another dabbling duck, another winter migrant. This flock I took. I was standing on the outer bank at Horsey, and these flew up or down the river towards Appledore, a flock of widgeon, and they're a winter migrant at about between 400 and 700 on the tour from about a bit later, about December to March, and they're bigger than a teal but smaller than a mallard. They're one of the dabbling ducks, and they spend their summers in Iceland or Scandinavia, and even in Siberia. They fly off that far, and they have that distinctive whistling call. The sort of the widgeon almost sounds like it's sort of widgeon like that. I can't do those calls, but it's very distinctive. And also, there's in flight. There's a female on the left coming into land, and a male on the right, and then in the water is a male and a female on the water there, and they're close up. Incredible vermiculation, as they call it, on the flanks and wings of the bird. That vermiculation, like small worms, it means, which they are. They're sort of like wiggly worms, and I think it's probably something to do with camouflage. It helps break up the outline a little bit, and that on the male, that lovely deep reddy brown head with the beige brow and the light blue bill, just a lovely color combination. And I thought I'd finished the presentation, but then I got an email from Devon Wildlife Trust, which put in some numbers from Rob Judson of what's been seen. And Rob had told us that he'd seen the largest ever flock of pintail on Horsey. I think it was over 50 birds. We'll come on a bit later on to what the actual count was, but the pintail is just one of the most elegant ducks. And Rob had been down there in January and seen these with his telescope. Quite hard to see them in the middle there, and it's high tide. They're definitely like the higher water. They won't be interested in Horsey when it's low tide, but if you go there at high tide, you might be lucky enough to see a group of these still around. This is the male with the pointed tail, and they quite scarce in Devon. Probably only about 200 in the whole county here, and Rob's seen 50 of them, but it varies from year to year. There's not much evidence that they breed in the county, so just a winter visitor. And they use that long tail in breeding display and raise it quite spectacularly. And in feeding, they just upend themselves in shallow water, just like a mallard would. And they feed on, favorite food is the hydrobia snail, the little tiny snails that you find in the mud. And there's another shot showing that again with the vermiculation on the side. Quite a long bill and long, elegant neck as well. And in flight, they're quite distinctive because they have I haven't got a flight picture, but the tail sticks out and the neck sticks out. So quite a distinctive bird to see in silhouette. Right, well, let's go on to the biggest duck of all that you can see. These are actually cruising by on the Tor, just off the outer bank, but I can assure you that there are hundreds of shelduck on Horsey, whether it's low tide or high tide, because they feed in the mud, and they use that lovely bill, wide bill, to you can see one doing it in the middle of the picture, just waving it about in the water and picking up snails and mollusks and other mollusks and insects. Again, the hydrobia snail is a favorite of theirs, and they're quite big. Their wingspan is well over a meter, up to 1.3 meters, which is well over 4 feet. And they weigh between a kilogram, for a female, up to 1.8 kilos for the larger male. And it's the male that has that knob, that basal knob. Let's go back to see. There's a male and a female. The male at the back there with this large basal knob on the bill. So that's a distinguishing feature. And also they're quite a lot bigger as well. Now they actually breed in Devon in quite small numbers. but they like to nest in rabbit holes, in flood banks or hedge banks on farms, and the adults pretty much all leave Devon in late summer, and they fly over to a massive gathering off Holland in the Waddenzee, on the north coast of Holland, and you might get 500,000 shelduck all there at once, and they molt and replace their feathers in the late summer, early autumn. Then they come back here. So magnificent duck, and again in flight, they are really distinctive and very boldly marked, and quite a sight. Almost the size of the male's almost the size of a goose, like a small barnacle goose, for example, that sort of size. And if you go down there tomorrow at probably mid-tide, you'll see hundreds of shelduck on Horsey. Now, that's finished with the ducks. What about the one of the smallest inhabitants of the area, and one of the most exciting to see, found on rivers all over Devon, and up the Cane, and sometimes there you can see on the channel at Horsey. They're tiny size. A lot of people are surprised when they first see one perched. They're only 16 centimeters long, of which 4 centimeters is the bill, and they only weigh 35 to 40 grams. So they really are tiny. Probably our most exotic looking bird, and that they might be overtaken by bee eaters if we continue to get bee eaters visiting and breeding in the south of England. But I'll take a kingfisher any day. They're absolutely beautiful. And they nest in burrows in banks, and Vellator is quite good because it's got those muddy banks that are good for burrowing in. And you can tell where they're nesting because there's a stream of white poo coming out, and their nests are famously filthy. Each young bird requires between 12 and 18 fish daily, so they have 3 or 4 perhaps in the brood, and each of those needs a dozen fish. So you can imagine the amount of waste material. And the interesting thing about kingfishers is they disperse to the coast in winter, very wise, because they can't cope with frozen water, of course, to feed. They dive in vertically. I haven't got one of those great diving pictures though. I've never yet managed to capture one of those. And in flight, it's incredible. They're unforgettable. They fly so fast with really fast wing beat, and you get that vivid blue flash on the back. That's usually what you see, and that's what gets etched in your mind. You don't really see the rest of it. You just see this blue flash, usually preceded by a loud chee call, which is really incredible to hear. The male's bill is all black, whereas this one is a female. It's got red, quite a lot of red on it. So that's a diagnostic feature, sexing feature. Now onto some the passerines, the perching birds. Kingfisher isn't a passerine, although it perches, but it's not classed as a perching bird. Meadow pipit, probably one of the most boring looking birds that we have at Horsey, but probably one of the most numerous, and it's incredibly important as part of the grazing marsh ecosystem. Clearly it likes, as its name, it likes grassland, and it eats a lot of seeds and insects, but it actually forms a food source for the higher birds, like the raptors, like kestrels will take them, and so will marsh harriers as well. So they're actually a food source for, and of course peregrines, food source for other birds. So they're part of the system, and they also happen to be the main host species for the cuckoo in Devon. And we haven't heard a cuckoo here, I don't think, since we've moved here, which is slightly worrying. I guess we may not have the right habitat, but for a cuckoo, but we've certainly got lots of meadow pipits that could host them. But I think the problems of the cuckoo are more to do with Africa and migration more than what ends up here. So meadow pipits nest on the ground in tussocky grass, and they spend most of their time on the ground. And if you walk along the inner bank, you'll always be disturbing meadow pipits in the ground, and the pipit is a good name because that's what its call sounds like, and they often are around in quite large flocks in the winter. Now we have the stone chat, which is a favourite of mine. It's very closely related to the robin. It's in the same sort of group of birds, and you can see them again along the flood bank and the toll road and the ditch. They tend to sit up. They start to do it now. Sit up in the hedgerows along the ditches, very strongly territorial. So if you sit around and wait, if you've disturbed it, they'll come back and sit on a post and look at you, and then they'll jump off the post down to the ground and grab some insect or other and back up again and eat it. Most of our wintering birds here are probably relocations from Dartmoor and Exmoor down to the coast, which is what they tend to do. They breed up or higher up. But we do have a resident population as well. You can see them here all year. This is one in its winter colours. It's not particularly bright. You get a lot of whiteness where the feathers get worn. And the population is very susceptible to harsh winters, but they generally recover quite quickly from that. And there's one taken in late summer where you can see some of the brighter breeding plumage, and that's taken just by the White House, the hedge there. I was waiting on my bike for a car, and I suddenly spotted this little bird watching me intently, and you can see some in the background, some of the insects slightly out of focus that it was eyeing up. And then the linnet, which again is a winter visitor, probably more common in South Devon than it is up here, but along the Torridge, they tend to like coming to the estuaries from the gorsey habitats inland. It's one of the finch family, and I'm afraid it's in decline, probably due to the lack of winter stubbles, because the farmers are changing their agricultural practices and not leaving so much stubble, and their equipment is so efficient at grabbing every single grain off each stem that there's less seed around for them to feed on. That's affected lots of other birds like the yellowhammer as well. We don't see very many yellowhammers because they need that food that got left on the land in the autumn. So it's often associated with heathland and gorse, but it's very happy to be on the estuaries and in the burrows in the winter. The male has this plumage here, which is in winters quite dour, but you can see patches of crimson and orange and so on. Let's look at one in the summer. There's one with a crimson breast and on top of the head, much brighter colours. And this is absent in the females. You have to tell a female by the shape of the beak and the overall way it sits and looks at you like that. They're quite will allow you to get quite close before they fly off. So it's you can get photos like this fairly easily with them. Same with the stone chat. They're remarkably patient with fumbling photographers, and you often see them in large flocks along the top of hedgerows. Lovely little bird, and famous. The Victorians used to love linnets as cage birds, unfortunately, but for their call, which was very sweet and pleasant to listen to. Now here's a real singing specialist. This is the sedge warbler, another bird that's really lovely to photograph because they're so intent on that shattering torrent of exuberant song that they can often allow you to get quite close and snap a picture of that lovely yellow gorge pouring out this sound of early spring and summer. And I can still remember the feeling of listening to this one, thinking, what a fantastic sound, what evocative of days to come. That was a lockdown sedge warbler, that one. So it migrates here, tiny bird. It will cross the Sahara from the Sahel right up to France or Spain, south coast, in one flight, usually at night, of course. And so incredible migration that it undertakes. It nests low in the brambles. So all the way, this is taken actually looking away from Horsey, just towards across the ditch and into the brambles on the other side of the ditch. And it's very confiding. It lets you get quite close, unlike its cousin, the Chetty's warbler, which I think is now also, I'm sure I've heard it. Perhaps Rob will correct me on that, but I'm sure that I've heard Chetty's warblers along there as well. And that's very difficult to spot because it skulks in the scrub. And it's become resident in the UK only since the 1960s. So that's the sedge warbler. And then you won't have failed to see these. Pied wagtail, one of Devon's most widespread breeding birds. And it occurs in town centres, farmland, on beaches and streams. And you see them, if you sit on a bench anywhere, virtually, there'll be a pied wagtail looking for food in the pavement or wherever. It nests in nooks and crannies in walls, often near water. And they gather in large communal roosts in the autumn and winter, often boosted by migrants, and they're quite happy to be on the beach. This is at Broad Sands on the beach there. Regularly see them there. And they're very agile, so they'll catch insects on the ground, but if they see one flying above, they'll leap up in the air and catch a flying insect. And they have this distinctive bobbing tail, as their name implies, the wagtail. And this is even more apparent in their cousin, the grey wagtail. Now that's a rather murky shot taken from a long way away, but that's on the River Cane at Velator, just working its way along the riverbank there. And this is very closely associated with running water, and it has an even longer tail. And in the summer, they like the upland rivers and streams, and they really need clean water for their prey to find the insects and so on that they eat. And they react badly to insecticides as well. So they're on the decline, and we need to look after birds like this. I mean, looking at it from above, it looks nice, and you can see why it's called a grey wagtail. But you look at it from underneath, and you think, blimey, that's amazing. Because that's the same bird, but this is in winter too. But it's a striking color pattern, and of course their other close relative, the yellow wagtail, is yellow all over, and we see very few of those. I'm afraid that's a real farmland bird. We used to see them in West Yorkshire sometimes, but I'm afraid they're dying out too. Mostly see them on migration. Right, now time to look at the waders, because this is what Horsey will become famous for. I'm sure that it already was famous for these flocks of grey plovers. Now this photo, you can tell this was taken in late October 2017. So this is before the great breach happened, and you can still see grass, you can see sedges, you can see healthy bushes on the far bank, hawthorn and probably blackthorn there, and these large rushes, spiky rush, I think, and sedge there and grass. So that's what it looked like. And at that time, you'd probably find these golden plovers feeding there, but I'm afraid they probably don't feed because they don't like mud. They're not great. They tend to like earthworms a bit more. I may be wrong there, but that's what it looks like now. So the habitat's changed to sand and mud, but the plovers are still there. They still come and roost there. So this is late afternoon, a winter afternoon in December, and you try and count those. Take my word for it, there are often 2,000 to 3,000 of them in one flock. Quite a spectacular thing. Now, I'm afraid because they're very, very shy, I haven't been able to get a close-up of a golden plover, but this is what they look like. If you can imagine that whole bird coloured golden and with the white, obviously, that's what they look like. And this is a picture by my very favourite bird artist, Charles Tunnicliffe, and he did this for an edition of Farmers Weekly back in the 1940s. And he used to produce these wonderful woodcuts every week for Farmers Weekly. And this particular week, he chose the golden plover in winter plumage. And summer plumage, which we never see here because they're gone, they look like that. So a really handsome bird. And I'm grateful to the RSPB for for letting me show that. The summer plumage of the golden plover, and I guess it might start to appear in the birds before they leave in March, but I haven't yet spotted it. Perhaps my friend Rob Judson has. He'll tell us later, I'm sure. And then when they take off, you know, they get spooked very easily. It might be a predator, or maybe just, you know, it's before they settle down, like starlings. They'll go down into a reed bed and come up again. Well, golden plovers seem to settle and then fly up again and fly around in these huge whirling flocks. This is a tiny portion of the flock, and I was trying to use I've got a 400mm lens. I was trying to zoom in on part of the flock, the densest part, to get all the flight pattern. And then there they wheel past you. You see the white underside and the quite dark tail as they go past. So we get 3,000 to 4,200, I think, have been known here. So that's an incredible number, and they're often very closely associated with this. That's a December 2020 shot of the flock before it settled to roost, and a bit closer up. So just an amazing sight, and the noise that they make as well, like calling all the time as well. So if you get down there, you know, 4 o'clock now, they're starting to settle. It's a good time sometimes, as long as it's low tide and there's some land there for them to sit on. And they're very closely associated with these wonderful birds, the lapwings. And the lapwings seem to be more effective at finding the worm-rich pasture that both birds really like. So you often see them working the same field because they together they're known as the grassland plovers. They're both plovers, and the lapwing is very distinctive. It has those huge wings, which we'll have a look more at, and a lovely crest. And you start to see on the wing there some of the iridescent feathers that they display, again depending on what the angle is to the light. And I've spent many happy moments trying to will a lapwing to turn around just a bit more, so I get some more color in the feathers, but sometimes you don't get lucky. So in flight, their wings seem to be inordinately large for the size of bird, but what it does give them is extreme maneuverability. So they're able to outwit birds that might be chasing them, and also put up a big fight to other birds like crows and rooks that might be bothering them. So they're quite aggressive, and they seem to be, as I said, a little bit more intelligent than the golden plover at finding food. Both of them roost at that narrow end, that northern end of Horsey, and are easily visible from the flood bank with the naked eye, or even better with binoculars, and even better with a telescope. Most of them breed in northern England, and there's decreasing evidence of breeding, well, certainly by the golden plover over the past 20 years on Dartmoor. They used to. So the lapwing is numerous as well. Don't get quite such large flocks. Probably 2,700 were seen, for example, in January 2017, when it was a patch of cold weather, and it's often around about 1,000, and you might see flocks of 300 or 400 at once flying around Horsey. It's aptly named for its flapping, broad-winged flight, and its other name is peewit, and that sounds very like its call. And the birds that we get here are augmented by birds coming in from Scandinavia and Western Europe, and even Western Russia in the winter. And it's one of those birds, again, that you hear that the way that farmers farm and the way we manage land now is not helping them, because the pastures that they need, the sort of unimproved grassland they need at a certain height of sward is much less common now. And their chicks actually need the insects that you find in unimproved grassland. So it's quite a worry, really, that we're losing these big spectacles, and we've got to do everything we can to make sure that their time here in the winter is as undisturbed and productive as possible. So we're enabling them to feed up and give them, you know, a fighting chance of breeding well in the spring when they leave us. So a lovely bird. There's various shots of lapwing flock in flight, and you can see it there, bottom left. The other name for it is the green plover, and it can look very green, but equally can look sort of almost black from some angles. And again, those big flappy wings. Now, another one that I want to look at is the redshank, because that's very common, very tiny wader. Probably only weighs you know, about 300 grams, I think. And it's another wader that's in decline, unfortunately. A winter visitor. I say winter because they'll be back here in August and September, and they'll stay until March again. We get about 200 along the estuary, up to 400 perhaps in this February, and they typically feed along the water's edge. They use this even sort of bobbing walk with steady pecks, you know, for their prey, just along the edge there. Lovely little birds. And they have a cousin called the spotted redshank, which is slimmer, slightly taller and slimmer, has a much jerkier gait and a very white breast. And I haven't, that's you often see them on Fremington Pill. There's usually one or two there. Probably we get them over here too, I'll be told. I haven't seen one myself. The spotted redshank goes almost black in summer. Very dark plumage, so easy to tell then. But its other name is the sentinel of the marshes, because you can be sure that if you put your head above the flood bank and there's a redshank there, it'll take off this shattering, ear-splitting call that just scares every other wader in sight off. So usually curse them. But they are a lovely, lovely little bird. You can get a close look at them in the mud. And that's what they look like when they take off. And distinctive, that white V in their back and the white end to the feathers there, the black primaries, really distinctive sight. It shows up really strongly. Even this is taken at dusk, and you can see it almost glows. Now, the oyster catcher, a very common sight and sound along the whole estuary, and often on Horsey. These two were just near the White House as the tide was going out, and about 1,000 birds are here along the estuary right from August through to early March, when they go away and nest. There's only about 10 pairs, I think, that nest along the estuary. Most of them go away. So we don't have very many breeding birds of this type of waders in the area, because we don't provide the habitat, and we've got such a huge human population now, so much disturbance. It's hard for them to find places, because they're usually ground nesters. They normally nest in a shallow scrape on a beach in shingle or in sand. And I think only about 60 pairs in the whole of Devon actually nest here. So they have to move away to breed. But a lovely bird, and in flight, just spectacular. And even more, if you usually what I do is scare them, and so that's what you usually see of an oyster catcher. They'll take so much, let you get so close, but often it's the back end of them you see. But what a memorable sight. I mean, I say I disturb them. I have to take great care not to, but inevitably they do get disturbed, and you only have to do a fast movement or something and they're off. Waders are notoriously shy birds. Now, onto our largest largest wader in the UK, actually. That we have about a quarter of the world's population of curlews in the UK. They weigh up to a kilo compared to about it's 160 grams for a redshank. So just imagine that this is about 6 times as heavy as a little redshank. The body size is actually similar to a mallard, with a bill about 15 centimeters long, huge, long, downward curved bill, and this wonderful cryptic plumage, which enables it to hide quite well in its habitats, certainly in the summer when it's nesting. It used to be quite a common breeder here, but now they're truly a bird in crisis, and a shocking decline of about 50% of their numbers in the last 20 years. So something is going wrong, and it's again related to farmland. Most of the UK native birds breed on farmland in the uplands, so they like to be high up and wet pastures and moorland. And if you think about it, we're losing a lot of that, and they tend to go back to the same nesting site each year, and that can be an advantage or a disadvantage. And they defend these territories vigorously, but it means that we have to take action. There's a Wildfowl and Wetland Trust are doing a very great project to help them when they're breeding. So they'll put electric fences around nesting sites. It'll even move broods of eggs, take them away and raise them to make sure that they do survive. So that's extreme because it's taking the eggs away from the parents, and that doesn't seem very humane, but the bird is in such crisis that they feel they have to do that. And I suppose the curlew is one of those species that are an indicator of ecosystems in crisis. It means that the UK habitat, which used to be so good for them, is no longer working. So it means that estuaries, coast, farmland, moorland, all of which are habitats they use, all have problems. And I think we can take steps at Horsey to make sure that at least we're managing their winter life well. So on the farm, farms, that they suffer from predation from things like foxes and crows, where in the UK we have the densest population in Europe of these quite common predators. It's all very well to say foxes are great, but actually they do a lot of damage to certain other species. So we can play a part at Horsey to try and ensure they survive, because I'm sure no one would want to miss that wonderful haunting call that you hear the curlews make. And there's one walking along with typical gait before it stops and places that long beak way down. So you'll have noticed that a lot of the waders have different lengths of beaks, and that enables them to feed at different depths in the mud, and therefore they're not competing too much with each other. So that's really important. Shows how I think it's called, what's it called, radiation of species, that they develop different characteristics to enable them to continue to survive and not compete directly on with other waders. So that's it with the waders for a bit. Oh no, just before we leave, this is here you are. Have a look at this. So now look at the head of the curlew, and it's just that normal streaky feathers, and then you look at this one. Now that's different, isn't it? It's got 3 stripes. It's got a white stripe down the middle of the head, a black stripe, a white eye stripe, and then a black stripe through the eye. And this is a whimbrel, which is very similar, but we only see them on migration. So you might see them in April, May, quite commonly passing through here. We're quite lucky because in Yorkshire, they used to have to get up in the middle of the night to see whimbrel on passage through to Scandinavia or further north, because they don't breed in the UK. They are well north of the Arctic Circle. A lot of them breed. so we only see them in the spring or sometimes in the autumn. So Iceland they'll go, and they overwinter in West Africa. So the Tor Torridge estuary in February is not where you'll find them. But I thought I'd put one up because in case you happen to be out and thinking it's a curlew, just look at the head, those distinctive stripes, and a slightly shorter bill, although it's really hard to tell that. I go for the head every time. And those are curlews in flight, and it's unfortunately quite a rare sight. I took these again over Horsey in 2017, and I haven't seen a flock like that in the right light for quite a while. So that's a bit of a worry. Okay, finished with the waders, but now we're on to the herons. And we've got here the little egret feasting on a crab, but just freshly arrived in the area of land below the inner bank that was flooded with seawater, and now got crabs in it. So that's a couple of years old, that shot. And I'm afraid you really know you're getting on a bit if you can remember a time when seeing an egret was a real bonus, and people used to drive for miles to see a little egret because they were so rare. And Devon actually was one of their first footholds in the UK, and it caused great excitement in the 1980s, apparently, on the River Exe when they first arrived from France. So it's very elegant, slender, small heron, and you'll have seen them there, you can't miss them, with immaculate white plumage, the black legs and yellow feet. And that, as I say, they've gradually expanded north and west through Europe, up the west coast of France, right up to the Netherlands, and then across to the UK. And their first confirmed UK breeding was in 1996, and now there's well over 700 pairs, plus many more visitors in winter. They probably were here in the Middle Ages, and they disappeared around the Little Ice Age, around the 16th, 17th century, and they never came back. But it's also it's recorded that the Archbishop of York held a banquet in 1465 at which over 1,000 little egrets were consumed. Can you imagine that? I suppose there isn't a lot of meat on them, but it just seems a shame, doesn't it? And then their return wasn't helped by the Victorian fashion for egret feathers in millinery, and in the breeding season, you can't see it here because they're not. This is a sort of autumn shot, but they have very long feathers from their crest and breast, very light feathers that are fantastic, I'm told, for hats. And in 1885, more than 750,000 egret skins were sold in London for the millinery trade. That's 750,000 egrets. And in 1887, 1 million were sold by just one dealer in London. So you can tell that it had a struggle coming back to become a common bird here. Fortunately, the fashion for hats has disappeared pretty much. Now, as you can see, they feed on crustaceans, also fish, amphibians, and large insects, and even small mammals if they can get hold of one. So a vole or something might be swallowed up. And they have a wonderful, elegant takeoff from as we disturbing yet another bird on Horsey, but you can see the glasswork growing behind it there. Now, I wanted to look at some rarities because Horsey does indeed have some rarities, and some of them have been seen quite recently. So here you have 2 egrets, and you can see one is gigantically bigger than the other. So the little egret is the bird in flight on the right with the yellow feet, and the one with the yellow bill and long yellowish legs is the great white egret, which is a real rarity. In fact, it's called a vagrant, but it seems very harsh to call a bird as handsome as this a vagrant. So great white egrets have been visiting Devon since about 2010, mostly to the estuaries on the south coast. And here's one actually on Horsey, but the other one was too, in 2018. 1 or 2 came that year. But now they've started to breed in Somerset and in northwest France. So we're likely to see a few more of them. They still are rare as a bird in Western Europe. If you go to Eastern Europe, they're quite common, and they're common right across the, right around the world in those sort of latitudes, and in Asia and Caribbean and as well. They stand as tall, sometimes even taller than a grey heron. They tend to be a bit more upright than a grey heron, and the wingspan is substantial. It's up to 1.7 meters. And when I say it's 3 times as heavy as a little egret, you get some idea of the size. This is a substantial bird. Very exciting to see that there flying over Horsey with Flemington in the background there, and the still almost intact outer bank. So a few years ago. And there's one in flight a bit more close up with a yellow bill. And one coming into land. Very, very elegant, like a Japanese print, really. Sort of bird you see on decoration on pottery and Roman mosaics and things like that. Now, its smaller cousin has just started to arrive here. This is the cattle egret, and we're starting to see them now on the marshes and on Horsey. First bred in the UK in 2008 and expanding to breed in Devon in 2017. And this has spread north even further from Morocco and southern Spain. And they tend to visit in autumn. Just a few stay over for the winter. They were badly affected by the beast from the east in March 2018. So most of them are in South Devon. Clearly that's easier for them to get to. And just only very recently started to appear in North Devon. But cattle egrets are a different type of feeder from most other herons and egrets. They tend to follow large animals. So a lot of birds do that. The wagtails do that as well. But the cattle egrets because they're bigger, they're fearless and get right up close to the cattle, and they pick up the insects that the cattle are disturbed by their feeding and by their movement from the hooves. They're smaller than a little egret with a shorter bill, and doesn't really show it here, but yeah, you see that buff crown, and the breast is quite buff in spring, but these are autumn winter pictures, so you don't get that, and we probably wouldn't see them here in the summer anyway, or spring. So that's the cattle egret. Quite exciting to start seeing them. And then another white bird that's started to move in. This is the spoonbill, and these have been seen at Velator and on Horsey this autumn winter. In size, they're somewhere between the little and the great egret, up to 1.5 kilos and 1.3 meter wingspan. They have this distinctive flattened bill. Now, this is taken from the outer bank on Horsey with a big lens, but even so, I'm not really close enough. So I'll take the liberty of zooming in just on that same shot, because you can see the bill a bit better there. And it is extraordinary. If you watch the last episode of Winter Watch this season, they'd made a experimental spoonbill bill out of by what do they call that, printing, computer printing, and they found that its shape actually creates suction in the water and draws the prey into the bill. So they move it about from side to side, slightly open and sweeping it through the water, and then the bill snaps shut on the prey, so that tip is incredibly sensitive to fish and mollusks and crustaceans that might be entering the bill, and it snaps shut, and then they can then use their long tongue and swallow it. But a lovely bird, and another one that was probably a familiar sight in before the 16th century in England, before we had that massive change of weather. And Henry VIII had banquets that often featured 2 spoonbills and amongst a whole other stuff. But again, the fen drainage, when the Dutch came in and drained the fens in the 17th century, that really did for them. And they didn't come back until the 20th century. And there's a small colony at Holcombe National Nature Reserve where they've been breeding since 2010. And this year, 28 pairs produced 56 young. So those are sort of homegrown spoonbills. The ones we're getting here are probably from Holland, where they've been very successful. And more locally at RSPB Arn, where in Dorset, where there's a large wintering colony. And Mary and I have seen them on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy, which really is only 100 miles away from the South Devon coast. So they're really not far away. We get a small number, about 6 to 7 on the Tor and Torridge. And a lot of them spend time at Iley Marsh or Pen Hill, and occasionally at Horsey and Velator. So they've been seen here since the late 80s, I think. But I think we're seeing them more frequently now. Here's one at Iley Marsh flying over a little egret with its bill slightly upturned. Don't know whether they get any lift from that. Now, this is another one, which again has been seen on Horsey, the glossy ibis. Now, this picture was actually taken on its winter home at Fremington Pill, where it seems to spend a lot of time. It's only one bird, another vagrant, as they say, mostly to South Devon, and it's been proved from bird rings that they've been able to decipher that they're coming from the Coto Doñana in southern Spain, that wonderful wetland reserve where they breed. And in some lights, it can look almost black. I've tried to wait for it to show some of its color, but I'm afraid in winter, it never is as bright as it is in spring and summer. So I've cheated a bit, and I've got the next one. This is a picture I took on the Ebro Delta in Spain in May, and you can see there, that's the breeding colors, that beautiful sort of maroony brown breast and neck, and then the green, iridescent green and blue feathers in the wings and tail. Just a wonderful, wonderful bird. And even in Southern Europe, it's a bit special to see one. You can see there that on the Ebro, they have these lovely rice paddies where they grow the rice that goes into paella, that fluffy sort of big rice. And they absolutely love the rice paddies for feeding in. If you go over towards the Balkans and the Middle East, you'll probably see more of these. But we've got one in North Devon, which is great. Well, now it's time to look at the last group of birds I wanted to look at, the raptors at Horsey, because they are there, but sometimes you have to be a bit quick to see them, or lucky. This is a male marsh harrier, flying above the reed bed at Velator about 4 o'clock on an autumn afternoon before it comes into roost. And typically they roost on the Tor and the Torridge in the autumn and winter, and always float over a reed bed, find a suitable place to spend the night. So the marsh harrier is the same bird flying overhead, and that's a male. You can tell there's lots of grey in the wings. We'll see a female in a minute. So it was extinct actually in the early 20th century, rose up to about 4 pairs in the 1950s, and then crashed again due to pesticides, like many other raptors, the peregrines, sparrowhawks. There was only one breeding pair left in the UK in 1971. And then, thanks to the RSPB reserves in East Anglia, 30 pairs raised 100 young each year from the late 1980s. So that was quite good going. So it clearly was part of our ecosystem. We needed to have it back. And it's so closely associated with reed beds, which we haven't got an awful lot of. So on the Tor and Torridge. And they're a wonderful sight to see, hunting low. Here's one actually taken at Leighton Moss in Lancashire. I've cheated a bit, but I wanted to show you the male coloration, these lovely silvery grey wings with black tips and the brown head and main body. Absolutely wonderful bird. This slow flapping flight and a glide. And the males are generally a bit smaller than the females, as is normal with raptors. And they feed on wildfowl, small birds, frogs, small mammals. And if one floats over, you can see the smaller birds just going bonkers and vacating the area swiftly. So they're much feared by the rest of the bird population. Now here's a female, completely different. You always say it's a different species, and that's true of nearly all. I think all the harriers all look different, completely different. The male and the female. Female here with beige head and very brown coloration. You see there how long their legs are, and they use those to grab the prey. It takes deft handling to catch a frog, and they use those to great effect. And a special visitor. Anyone tell what that is? Well, it looks like a black-headed gull from some angles, but that in fact is an osprey, and flying away from me with its characteristic head down head pose, and then coming towards you with catch with a lovely yellow eye. Very scarce visitor here on passage, mostly in April, May, best to see them, and August, September, with just a tiny number coming through on their way either towards or back from Scotland or Wales, where they're starting to show some real strongholds in breeding. So the only pure fish-eating raptor, I think white-tailed eagles will take fish, as we've seen, but the osprey won't take anything else, just fish. And it's usually spied in this area, sitting on a post near the mouth of the River Cane. But I take it from me, it's still a very rare sight, because if I admit to you that I've never seen one here, this is a photo that I took in Trinidad, and it was a remarkably lucky shot because I was sitting in a bandstand on a yacht harbour, and I thought, what's this big gull coming towards me? And it hadn't seen me at all, and I had my camera ready because I was photographing pelicans at the time, and it flew on and on and on. This is getting bigger and bigger in my lens, and as you can see, it filled the frame. So I had a few shots that were out of frame, but it had a lovely fish in its claws, and you can see there it's suddenly seen its eyes fixed on the camera and me, and it wheeled off to the left and got out of the way. But you're very lucky to have them flying towards you. Take it from me. Very lucky even to see them here. So those of you who have seen one, well, good on you. Well done. It takes luck and patience. But hopefully we will see more of them as the population increases. And after all, we have a huge population of mullet and bass in our very rich estuary. So we've got plenty of food. We just need some good trees for them to nest in. We haven't really got the sort of tall trees near the water that they need. Maybe some over the other side at Yelland might do, but they need also not to be disturbed, which is the other factor. Well, let's look at another more common one. This is what we see flying over our house in Braunton, and you do as well. The sparrowhawk. This one's a male. You can tell that because it's got that red coloration, orange on the chest. And if we look at a female in a minute, you'll see the difference. It's a slightly shorter tail than the female, and very broad wings. And the way they fly is distinctive. So my wife Mary often looks up and says, that's a sparrowhawk, because it's gone flap, 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 glide, flap, 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 glide. And that's what they do. Very sort of erratic pattern, but that seems to do them very well. Fairly common here, often in our gardens, and it's one of our smallest UK birds of prey. And they'll take pigeons, blackbirds, starlings, meadow pipits, of course, house sparrows, blue tits, and they can carry their own weight in prey. It's an amazing, powerful flight. And they tend to be mobbed by jackdaws and rooks, and even swallows and martins will attack them because they're quite small. Very secretive, and they'll hide up, like this one at the White House, just hiding up in an alder tree. I just popped my head round the corner, and there's this fierce bird looking at me, and we stared at each other for, it seemed, an age, and I was able to get bring the camera to my eye and photograph, and it just looked very fierce, didn't like being disturbed, but I think it thought it met its match in me, and so it disappeared soon after. They hunt at very low level. You'll see them often swooping through the garden, over the hedge and along ditches, ambushing their prey. It's a real ambush hunter, and uses incredibly long legs. So you can see there, here's the leg. You see it starts up here, and it's all this. There's the claw there. So they'll catch their prey, they'll thrust those legs out in front of them and catch the bird, as they come towards them with the claws outstretched. Very difficult to see because it happens so fast. And their numbers were down by 50% in the 60s in the southwest, and virtually wiped out in eastern England, where I was living at the time, Brighton, southeast. We never saw sparrowhawks. Then gradually they came back, and now they've got quite a strong population again, which is good to know. And I've used this before, but this was one. I was standing astride my bicycle on the toll road, and I saw this bird sitting on a stone in the ditch about 50 yards away. And I thought, that does look like a very large thrush. What's it doing? And then I pointed the camera at it, and it was a perching sparrowhawk sitting on this stone, completely oblivious to me, didn't seem bothered by me at all, because it had fixed its gaze there on probably a meadow pipit or something further down the ditch, and it took off and flew past at a rate of knots. And I'm using a 1600th of a second here on my camera, which is pretty fast, but only the eye actually is in focus, and the beak. The rest of it is all in motion. But it's a good shot for showing that extended middle claw of you see that one hanging down here? This is the one that grasped the prey. It's got a fierce hook on the end of it. Anything that comes in range of that is dead. And they are just absolutely ruthless with small birds, as we know. And we often see the evidence of just a pile of feathers or a ring of feathers on the lawn. So anyway, they're part of the food chain. A very fine bird. And this is a much bigger bird. This is a buzzard, common buzzard, and this one was hunting just again standing on the inner bank, turning away from Horsey, and I saw this sort of medium bomber flying at low level across the grass there. I think hoping to take a lapwing, because there's a whole flock of lapwings there and just out of focus in the background. Obviously intent on something. So you will see them flying at low level. So probably the commonest large raptor anyway, in the area, often seen over the marshes and in our wooded valleys. 1.25 meter span, quite big. And it often sits on posts. So this one's at the White House and hadn't spotted me. I just came along the hedge and there I saw it and managed to get a shot before it took off. And just a lovely bird. Nests in trees or on the cliffs, and feeds on much larger prey, rabbits, voles, beetles it'll take, and worms even. Not quite partial to an earthworm, and lizards and snakes as well. So quite a variable amount of prey. And they can actually, as well as flying very low like that, like a sparrowhawk, they can fly and hover motionless in the wind like a kestrel. And that's quite a sight to see, a big bird like that just hanging there. So that's a more normal sight of a buzzard. Again, that was over the marsh. And in French, they're called the buse variable, which means variable buzzard, and the variable relates to their plumage. So this one's quite a light one, but you can get almost white ones. And I was fooled once because I was sure that was an osprey coming towards me. No, it wasn't. It was a buzzard, and just a very, very pale one. Some of them even paler than that. So the variable buzzard. And this is another low-flying missile. This is a kestrel, which actually you usually see like this, hovering, and that's hovering over the Horsey bank. But then this is a juvenile, just developing its coloration, and this is an adult female, flying very, very fast, and it just again, taking the sparrowhawk technique of flying low and just swooping up over the bank, hoping, I think, to grab a meadow pipit on the other side, because it would have been invisible. It would have arrived very fast. So the kestrel, one of the easiest raptors of all to watch because of this hovering. Oops. And they'll let you get quite close if they're intent on something. Having made a comeback in the 1980s along the motorway verges in the 90s, after very bad pesticide effects in the 50s and 60s, the kestrel is again under threat, I'm afraid. So we've got to look after our population. And again, it's the small mammals, the beetles, the lizards, the earthworms are prey for this one. So a lovely bird. This is a falcon. So the buzzard is an accipiter, like the golden eagle and the marsh harrier and the sparrowhawk, whereas this is a falcon, which is entirely different. Although they look very similar, they're only, like the swifts and the swallows, they're only related because they're not related at all genetically. They're related because they have the same flight pattern, the same, the requirements of flight, and the same need to catch prey in claws and a hooked beak. So they developed to look much the same, but they're very different, I can assure you. This is a male with the grey head and quite a bit smaller. A lovely little bird. Remember seeing that film, Kes? I think that was a male kestrel. And I was captivated by that in the 60s. And one of the things that got me into really liking raptors, I think, because they're high intelligence and fantastic abilities, flying and visual and so on. So let's look at another falcon. This one sitting on top of a linny on Horsey, gorging on some nice choice. I think some, this was August, so it's eating a bird that must have been present in August, probably maybe one of the waders that had just returned, an unsuspecting redshank or something, because it flew across me as I was on the inner bank, and then I lost sight of it, and I started walking along the outer bank very carefully because of all the subsidence, and I put my bins on it. What's that? And there it was, sitting on a linny eating. So if you're very lucky, you will see peregrines at Horsey, and the higher the bird population there in the winter, the more likely we are to see peregrines, because that is a favorite thing for them to do. Although they will nest on rocky coasts and take seabirds in the summer, they will move inland to the coastal margins like estuaries and salt marshes and so on in the winter, and they'll take waders then. So it's a majestic bird, absolutely incredible sight to see with these powerful wings and that huge body, quite a heavy bird. It absolutely dominates wherever it flies. Every other bird is terrified by it because it will take even a small goose in flight. So that is something else, isn't it? I mean, there's not much that isn't scared of a peregrine. And I can recommend you that if you've got BBC Sounds, David Attenborough did some readings from a wonderful book called The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. He wrote it in the 1960s. Became a classic natural history book, and David Attenborough read 5 extracts from it in a week, I think it was. A beautiful, well, his lovely voice reading it, and then the beautiful words. It's so literary. You know, it's a literary classic as well. So I can recommend that. And it's actually one of the most widespread birds in the world. This one I took quite a few years ago at Mort Ho, actually. So I can't claim to have taken many shots of them on Horsey, but they are around. And as I said, it's the most widespread bird of all, really. It's present on every single continent except Antarctica. It has about 20 different subspecies, and our birds are part of what's called the nominate species. So it's Falco peregrinus peregrinus, but there are lots of Falco peregrinus other, other types. Our one is present from the UK right through to Japan, along that strip of temperate zone there, and then from northern Italy right up into Scandinavia and Western Russia. And peregrine means a wanderer, pilgrim, and it does, it does move about, as I say, between the coast and so on. And I think people used to think it wandered even further than that. It's the largest of the 4 British falcons. We've seen one of them, the kestrel, and the other ones are the merlin and the hobby. So just 4 falcons. The female's 50%, I think this one's a female, 50% heavier than the males. That's definitely a female. That one's taken at Hartland Point 2 years ago. And that just squawking at its juveniles who are playing merry hell with each other and really getting a bit close to humans. So it was a bit worried about them, I think. But they declined.
Sorry, Martin.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. It's a little bit past 9 o'clock now, so it'd be great to have some time for questions.
Yeah, of course. I'm finishing very soon.
I thought you might be, but I thought I'd better just check.
Yeah, we'll come to an end. So this one is the one you might see as well at Horsey in the spring, in April, May. This is a hobby, and you can tell they look very similar, but they have these brownish feathers under the tail there. So that's a hobby. Okay, and the final flying beast at over the marshes and Horsey. This is a Benton's bat that I took this picture at midday about 3 weeks ago, and I had it diagnostically checked by John Breeds and his bat team, and they tell me it's a Benton's bat, which is amazing. This is a water-loving bat, and a sad story, because we're losing the Outer Bank, we're probably losing our very best population of adders that were in the area, because they don't like salt water, and they certainly won't tolerate being surrounded by salt water. So they probably moved off. I hope they've moved off back into the burrows. And just to finish on a plant, this is the lovely sea lavender that grows on the Outer Bank of Horsey. So that's one for Mary Breeds there, the sea lavender. And that's a winter shot of what it looks like from the eastern end of the flood bank, right across the Saunton Sands Hotel there at top right. And I just wanted to leave you with what Rob Jutsam saw on the 15th of January in a 2-hour period just after high tide. You can see there, pick out 440 lapwing and 52 pintail, the most he's ever seen there. 115 widgeon. So see, this is a place that's going to be fantastic for watching birds, especially when we can build some screens or something to make them a bit more accessible to visitors and to want to see them. Okay, exciting times, and there's more to come. So thank you very much. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Martin.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was completely lost in birds. Do apologize for going on for so long.
That's fine. It's just amazing to hear, all your knowledge, and thank you for sharing your fantastic photos as well. They're absolutely brilliant. So we've got a bit of time to ask Martin some questions. So if you can use the raise hand icon on your more button, if you know where that is. You are over 2 screens, so if you did want to wave at me if you've got your camera on to ask Martin a question, or if you want to ask him something via the chat, and I can ask him for you. Has anyone got a question for Martin? Just check.
Or any corrections? That's what I'd like to know.
Oh, I've got Stuart. I've got a Stuart. Would you like to unmute yourself?
I was just going to ask, it's not what you said before, but have you ever seen a short-eared owl on Horsey Island? Because on Saturday, me and my dad saw one.
Did you? That's fantastic. Well, I know they are around, sometimes on the burrows and over the marsh. So you could well have seen one. That's really brilliant. No, I've never seen one of those. That's a great sighting to see. Well done. Did you get a picture of it?
We just got on mute.
No, we didn't get a picture because we were going along the outer bank and then we disturbed it and it flew away. But we could just but my dad could tell what it was.
Yeah. Did you see its wonderful yellow eyes?
I think he might have, but I did see the rounded face, which is how I knew.
And quite long wings. Lovely. Well done, Stuart. That's a really good sighting.
It kept on going and hiding behind tussocks of grass.
Yeah, well, that's what they love to do. They actually roost in the grass. So if it was late afternoon, it might have been coming in for a snooze.
Fantastic. Thank you for that one.
Really good, yeah.
And then a question from Mary. Do you feel that we're losing subcoastal habitats such as reed beds, which are used to border Horsey Mere through the new salt marsh habitats?
Yes, unfortunately, we will have lost what reed bed there was on Horsey will have died because it can't tolerate salt. So what we've got to do is make sure that we allow new areas of marshland to develop. So perhaps returning low-lying farmland and just allowing it to develop into reed bed. If we do that, then we're likely to get more species in as well. You might even get marsh harriers nesting, or more reed buntings and species that like that kind of habitat. So it's very important that we don't lose these things.
That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah,
has anyone else got a question? I'll just have a look over the screen, see if anyone's waving at me. Can't see anybody.
I've bludgeoned you into silence. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Well, lovely. Okay. Well, if no one else has got a question, I think you got off quite lightly there, Martin.
That's it.
But I'm sure if someone thinks of something later on, they can always get in touch with you. Oh, hang on.
Yeah, you can see my email address there, martin.batt@gmail.com. So any questions do.
Yeah, brilliant. Someone's made a comment there that they're missing the estuary as they moved away. So I'm glad you were able to join in and see some of the more recent photos from Martin then. So that's great. Oh, sorry, we've got one more question.
I'm on the other side at Appledore, so more of my birds are seen at Skern. Will they be, what would be the differences, or do you think it would be very similar?
Well, I've noticed when I come over to Skern there, Leisha, that it's you get a lot more of the Brent geese over there. You see flocks of geese on Skern. I think the muddy habitat there is more to their liking. You certainly get a different, when I come over in the summertime, I see more wheatears over there, for example, and I see more. You've certainly had things like the snow bunting over there this winter, and that's a really
I saw them last week. Really cute.
Yeah, lovely bird. So you do. They are very different habitats. We get a lot of shared species. You probably don't see as much of the golden plover over there as we do, because they go.
We get thousands of the plover. Yeah.
Oh, do you? Oh, good. Well, it's the same flock of birds, but they move
I'm sure it must be the same ones. Yeah. And then when they take off and they zoom past,
you see that? Oh, that's good. Yeah, I've never seen them over there, but the man to ask is Rob Jutson, of course. He'll
he's the bird man, isn't he?
He is.
Yeah. No, you're right. We do get the geese. All the ducks and things sounded similar. So
yeah.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you for that question. Yes, someone made a comment saying fantastic talk and amazing photos. So I think we can all agree with that. So yes, if we haven't got any more questions, we'll draw the evening to a close. Just to let you know, our talk next week, is with Charlie Spur from the Museum of British Surfing. So he's going to be talking all about the history and culture of surfing in North Devon. So we're really excited about that collaboration with our next door neighbours. So I hope you can join us for that. And we've got lots more talks coming up. Please do keep an eye out on our social media and our website as well, because we've got some more activities planned, as well as some more talks as well. So please do keep an eye out. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Your contribution is really appreciated, especially at this time. So it's, you know, really helping to keep us going at the Countryside Centre. So thank you very much. And finally, please join me in a virtual round of applause for Martin for an absolutely fantastic evening. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you. Very kind of you. Thanks for listening. You've been a great audience.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.